Hello and welcome. I'm painting a beach scene today, the kind of beach that's seen from the end of a pathway. And I got so excited when I found this image because I love that sense of anticipation you get when you reach the end of the pathway and you get that first glimpse of the sea. So that's what I wanted to paint, and really the star of the show in this image is the shadow that's cast by that little wooden fence on the side. So I was in a bit of a rush to do the sketch because I'm always impatient to get on with the painting, because that's the fun part, isn't it? And in this image there was this lovely warm glow on the horizon, so I made sure to put that in. And as you can see, I tend to be a bit messy in my palette, but as long as you're quick you can mop up any inadvertent colours. That, as you saw there, I had some of a dark green in my ultramarine blue, but if you're quick you can quickly solve those sorts of issues. And while I'm waiting for the sky to dry a little there, I'm making sure that I add some of that same pink. I think it's a permanent rose that I've got that I'm using. I used it in the sky, and then I never like to leave it just in one spot in a painting, so I'm making sure I'm popping it in the foreground there. And there are some wooden boards that are on that pathway, so I've got my flat brush out. I don't often use a different brush, but a flat brush is great for painting wood, I find. Wood and bricks are the two things I most often use that flat brush for. So I used it to quite easily put in straight lines for those boards, and I'm going to use it to paint the fence posts in a little while. And there is some vegetation growing on the sides of this path, but I wanted to make sure that it's not too vibrant a green, so I have dulled down my green with a touch of that same pink, the permanent rose there. And it's at this point where any of the sort of inaccuracies that I had in my rush drawing will become a little bit more tricky, because I have to work out which is the fence post and which lines are the spaces in between the fence posts. But so hopefully I've got that right. We'll see when I start putting in the posts themselves whether in fact I have. Now, that colour that you've seen me just put in there is one of my absolute favourites for painting sea. It's a colour called Cascade Green, and what I really love about it is how it splits into the multiple colours that make it up when you add the water. So it really gives you that lovely sea effect quite effortlessly, because, as you know, the sea reflects so many beautiful colours. And speaking of beautiful colours, that's another favourite in my palette, but I've got to admit I find it hard to include it in my paintings. It's a colour called cobalt turquoise, and it's quite opaque, which is not what I love in a watercolour paint, but it is fantastic for these beautiful oceanscapes, because it's that perfect turquoisey blue that we love to see. And I'm realising now that as much as I love the white sparkles on the paper, and I try to leave little white spaces, I've done that a little bit too much on that foreground. So I'm just going back and filling in with a bit more of my sand and board light colour, which is raw sienna. Well, to be honest, it's either raw sienna or yellow ochre. You might see in my palette there, it's the one on the bottom left, and then there's another one, the fourth one in towards the right. And to be honest, I often mix them up because Daniel Smith's yellow ochre and my Holbein raw sienna are awfully similar, so I don't think I needed both, but it's the sort of thing you only know when you've actually got them side by side to compare. And this is where I'm using that lovely shape of the flat brush to put in the straight lines of those fence posts. And because the shadow is one of my favourite things to paint, this is another opportunity to get in those lovely darks, because as much as we're wanting to paint the light, it's usually by popping in the darks that we actually get to do that. And I don't know if you saw there, it took me by surprise when one of my little paint pots has jumped out of my pan, and I couldn't find it for a while, and there it was sitting in the middle of my painting. On the left hand side, those fence posts were a lot lighter, so I'm putting in more of my light colours, and I think that's actually quinacridone gold that I've used because it's a little bit brighter and more vibrant, so it's distinguishing it a bit from the sand colour. And this is why I started with the sky, because I knew that there was foliage, these trees that are kind of growing on the sides of the path, and I have opted to paint them on top so that the sky is showing through in the little spaces between those leaves. So it's important that the sky was quite dry there for me to be able to achieve that. And it's these lovely trees that are casting the shadow, which is the thing I was so excited to paint. In fact, I feel like everything I've done so far was only there so that I could paint the shadow, because without some of those trees, the shadow doesn't make too much sense. And to do the shadow, I'm using this dark blue that I've got, and it was the dark blue that I put into the sea on that distant horizon line. But I don't want it to be too vibrant. I'm again wanting to dull it down a little. So I put in an orange just to, as I say, make it a little bit less saturated. And the sand is sloping up on the sides of that pathway, and that's making this wonderful angle of these shadows. And I like the shadows to have soft edges, so I'm just making sure that I use a clean brush to soften off those edges. And that was, there was a lot of hesitation. Because I've sped it up, you didn't see that, but I've got to admit that was the most tense moment of my whole painting there, where you've got to paint the shadow over everything you've done, and you can't help but wonder if you're about to mess it all up. But this is what is the fun of the painting, isn't it? You've got to be bold and have a go. And I'm using one of my favourite Chinese brushes there, which makes lovely irregular shapes to create those shadows. And I'd used a touch of purple along with the blue in the shadows earlier on the fence post, so I'm dropping in a bit of that purpley colour because the shadows are also in varying degrees, so it's not just one solid value. So I rather enjoyed adding those little bits in. I hope you enjoyed watching it too. Thanks for watching. See you next time.